So while we're waiting, I thought I'd give you a little bit of a heads up. We're going to be using Slido, and you can scan the QR code and then keep that open on your phone. And throughout the presentation, we're going to have questions. So I'm going to start it off with this particular, our first question now. So it gives you a little bit of opportunity to log in and play with this a little bit, and things will start populating on here as well. So we can start seeing and getting this interactive going. I think we need music or something. Jeopardy music. Sure. Oh, no, it's okay. We can, this way we get started. It's great that we actually can see everything happening. So don't close your browser so that you can keep on answering questions as we go through. And then this will keep on populating as well. So thanks. Backwards on that one.
You left it up there. It was fine.
Oh, here you go. So you're going to give our, Dean Luis is going to give our welcome, and welcome to Dean Iñaki for coming as well. And please give us some background on this. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I have the easiest job. Welcome. No. But in all seriousness, this is an important event for our school as well as the university in general and our broader community, working with colleagues at the School of Architecture. So I've been asked my counterpart, the Dean of the School of Architecture, to come up and say a few words about the program and what we're trying to do. And then once he's said that, I may fill in a little bit, and then we'll both sit down and hear from the real experts.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for hosting us to these strange people from architecture and public health. Just a few words just to say that what are these people in architecture doing here? No? And I would say the three words, community, health, and design, how we engage with this. We have at the School of Architecture a long history of working with our communities here in New Orleans. We have Anne Joachim there, who is, by the way, a public health professional, who is the director of our small center, Albertina Small Center for Collaborative Design. And we do projects, design, build, visioning, and others with the communities. Health related, and I would say also architecture and urbanism are fields that are extremely deeply involved with health from the very beginning. So Vitruvius, who was the Roman architect who founded the discipline, or who formulated the discipline of architecture, included sewage and drinking water as major roles for healthy settlements to be designed by architects. And then modern architecture in the 19th, 20th century was transformed fundamentally based in health, and in health of housing, in health of buildings. And the discipline of urbanism in the middle of the 19th century was again funded as a discipline based in the design of healthy cities, because that was the real challenge in the 19th century in several places in Europe and around the world. So that is a connection that is so close to our ethos as a field, and somehow it has been forgotten. So here we are to reconnect these two pieces.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep. So I want to thank all of you for coming here. If you look at the location of this school, we're on Canal Street, just off the I-10 interstate, one of the most prominent locations in this city. And if this spot was hosted a building that the city could then rent to a corporation or even sell to a corporation and then collects tax revenue for the city from, that would be ideal. But that's not the case, because our school is in this location. As a nonprofit, we don't pay taxes. And the way I think about that, I think about that all the time when I drive up to this building in the morning. And that the fact that we are in this location is, in my mind, the city is making an in-kind contribution to this school. And as a result, we have an obligation to be an asset for this city. This city is built below sea level and surrounded by water. Now, we can talk about the wisdom of building a city below sea level surrounded by water, but the reality is that this is where we are. And as a result, we are in one of the most fragile locations on the planet as it relates to climate change. As climate change unfolds, it's going to unfold here. We are literally like a canary. Well, we're not literally, we are metaphorically the canary in the minefield. And what happens here is ultimately what's going to happen all over this planet. There will be infectious tropical diseases in Peoria, Illinois one day. And it will come because as the climate changes, those disease vectors will be able to survive in climates that currently they cannot survive in. The work that we do is not only critical for today, but it is critical for the future of this country and the future of the world. When this school was established in 1912, the original mission statement talked about connecting New Orleans to the world. We are unique in that we have an intense mission to address the global issues that affect the world's population, but we also have an intense mission here in our local community. And the local community, the problems of the local community are the problems of the globe, which is an opportunity. And we're unique in the sense that I don't know of another public health school that is as committed both locally and globally. And we say that all the time because both missions are critically important, and most of our counterpart schools focus on one or the other. We need to do both. We don't have the luxury of not focusing on the problems of the Gulf South. And I think one of the most pressing, in my view, the most pressing problem in the Gulf South right now is climate change, because it's an existential threat to humanity. Our school needs to have strong programming in this area, in this space, because that is what the future workforce of public health the future public health workforce requires. And currently, we don't have the programming that we need to have. And as a result, we've established a set of visioning meetings that we've held and meeting with our community partners, and you'll meet some of those community partners here today to talk about what is a vision for addressing the Gulf South and climate change and how it will impact human health here in our community. This is, I believe, an existential threat that requires an all hands on deck approach, which requires community partners, which requires universities, other corporate citizens, and individuals to come together in a coordinated fashion. And that's what we're trying to do. And so this is not our first meeting, but this is our first public event where we're talking about the work that we've been trying to plan to do going forward. And this is the start of a long-term commitment to build out the resources that we need and the capabilities that we need to ensure this community is resilient enough to respond to the challenges that we should expect to face. So I'm delighted that we're finally here for this first event, first of many future events. I'm also particularly delighted that the School of Architecture is partnering with us here, because the nature of climate change is that it is such a amorphous problem that no one discipline has the capabilities of responding to this challenge. It requires an all hands on deck. So it requires public health. It requires architecture. It's going to require engineering. It's going to require all fields. And my hope is that we will be able to expand this initiative beyond the two schools and make this a truly university-wide and community-wide engagement that utilizes all of the assets that we have here in the community and not only academia. So this is the start. This is the vision. We've even named this symposium very intentionally because the role of community and community involvement in the research and also in the design of action, how we will take action. So the design of creating architectural responses, but also in developing policy solutions that'll be necessary to address climate change. And I think this is what the School of Public Health can really do. We can play a role as a convener of bringing people together, but ultimately we need the expertise of all. So thank you all for coming and to being a part of this conversation that we've been developing. And hopefully you'll stay with us as we go forward and build something that will be truly impactful to support the health of our community. Thank you all.
So thank you, Dean Leviste. And good evening, everybody. I'm Melissa Gonzales. I'm the chair of the Department of Environmental Health Sciences here at the Tulane School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. And this evening is our first event, as Dean Leviste pointed out. It's our first public big event on climate change and public health in the Gulf South, our symposium on community research, design, and action. So in collaboration with Dean Leviste and Dean Iñaki, we have designed tonight to be a visioning session among our panelists and you, the audience. So our purpose tonight is to cultivate an appreciation of the different ways communities, public health, architects, urban design, and planners understand and are working with climate change and health issues to foster a more holistic and inclusive approach to climate health research and resilience and action. So if you looked over our list of panelists and our topics, you probably were wondering, how do all of these things fit together? And to be honest, our panelists asked that same thing too. Am I cutting out every little bit? So our panelists asked the same thing too. They wondered, how does this all fit together? So I'm going to give you a roadmap, a framework to help explain how we all fit together so you can use this for the rest of your evening tonight. So here, let's start here. And this is where we are today in the Gulf South, in the city of New Orleans, where we are all neighbors, and all of us are living, working, growing, and aging together in this place. So in our environmental health framework, it starts with a source or a source of a pollutant. This can either be a man-made or a natural pollutant, such as smoke from a wildfire or emissions from motor vehicles or industry. Then the pollutant is released into the air, water, soil, where it's transported into our environments. And these are locations indoors, outdoors, at home, at work, at school, anywhere where we're spending our time. Then exposure takes place when the person interacts with their environment and that pollutant gets into their body. So via inhalation, ingestion, or skin absorption. And then once inside our bodies, there is, depending on the toxicity, there may be a health effect. And these health effects are understood at the mechanistic level by toxicology and at the group level or population level with epidemiology. So throughout this whole process, we have social determinants of health that are also impacting every aspect of this diagram, as well as the built environments and the designed environments that we live in as well. So occurring on a regular basis, we have natural and man-made disasters and emergencies. And in the Gulf South, those could include hurricanes, flooding, and temperature extremes. So where does climate change come in on all of this? Well, climate change impacts all of this. It is an overarching factor that is taking place and impacts from the source all the way to the health effects, physiologically, population-wise, and the social determinants of health. So we have our usual environment that's already very fragile, and now we have something additional on top of it. And as Dean Levy's pointed out, it is an existential threat in that particular, in that aspect. So this is a really complex scenario, and it needs a broad range of perspectives to understand, design, and take action to support public health resilience in the face of climate change. So tonight, we're going to offer a sampling of these perspectives. We're going to start off with Mostafijur Rahman from Environmental Health Sciences, who's going to give us an overview of climate change drivers and some of his own novel research into the impacts of air pollution, heat, and humidity on human health. Then Angela Chalk and Kimberly Doley will share with us their community-partnered work. Angela as the founder of Healthy Community Services, and Kimberly as the Policy and Advocacy Committee Coordinator for WaterWise Gulf South. Then Sarah Michaels from Tropical Medicine and Infectious Diseases will share her insights into shifts in vector-borne diseases. Sean Fowler from the School of Architecture will be sharing his vision for novel urban water infrastructure design. And finally, Stephen Murphy from the director of our disaster management program will share the resources that he and his team have created to support public health preparedness and response to climate-related events. So the panelists are going to be giving us the what, the why, and the who. What's the climate change public health link? What's the evidence to support this link? Who's at risk? And between panelists, we will have the Slido polls for your opinions. And at the end, some question and answer with your audience participation. So again, thank you for coming. And I'm going to start off with our first panelist, Dr. Rahman. Oh, and thank you for adding to the Slido. We'll present those later.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, okay. So as Dr. Melissa introduced myself, my name is Mostafijur Rahman. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Health Science and Tulane. So today I'll be talking about the effect of relative humidity, heat, and air pollution, and also the combined effect of this exposure. So I would like to start my talk from this conceptual diagram of the effect of climate change on health. So it's not an overall picture of the health effect of climate change. It's the simple version. Climate change is much more bigger than this picture. So there is another reason to start my talk from this picture, that currently when we talk about the climate change, I realize that people only restrict talking about the consequences of the climate change. Often forget that what is the main driver of the climate change? What is the response? Who is responsible for the climate change? And this is the fossil fuel combustion. So, and as my expertise is health effect of air pollution and climate change, and sometimes I see people get hard time to connect air pollution with the climate change, but it is very simple in the diagram. If you see there, the fossil fuel combustion, that is the main driver for the climate change, and fossil fuel combustion, that's the biggest contributor to the air pollution in the atmosphere. Even if you consider the New Orleans or Louisiana here, what are the main sources of air pollution? Traffic, then what next? The petrochemical industries. Like this is polluting us, and they are burning fossil fuel. So the fossil fuel combustion is the main driver of the climate change, but often we don't recognize that. We are only focusing on the upstream of the climate change, that is the wildfire, tropical storm, flood, and heat waves. And also, I will not talk about the health impacts of tropical storm and cyclone, tropical storm and flood today, because I think the people who are living in the New Orleans or Louisiana, they have their first-hand experience from these two calamities. So I will talk mainly about the effect of air pollution and the temperature, because the temperature is the most direct way that climate change is affecting our everyday life, because we feel it in every second. And temperature affecting our health through heat wave, cold spell, drought, extreme heat, and temperature variability, and also air pollution. We breathe in every second. We cannot ignore that. Like WHO named air pollution as new tobacco. This is a silent killer. We are getting slow poisoned by the air pollution, but we don't recognize that because we don't see it. We are just inhaling it. So this is a news report in the CNN that based on findings of the study that published in JAMA, that exposure to polluted air is like smoking a pack a day. Think about the consequence. Just living in a place, polluted place, we are getting the same consequence of health outcome if we would smoke a pack of cigarette in a day. It is huge, actually, and unavoidable. So I had opportunity to work in two different climate vulnerable, most climate vulnerable place. One is the Bangladesh. Many of you may know that it's a South Asian country. It's a neighboring country to the India, because many people knows about the India. And it's a developing country. And as it is a developing country, so it's understudied for environmental health. So so as my expertise on the air pollution, so I contributed to the air pollution health research in Bangladesh, but I want to do it in a little different way and with some novelty and add some policy relevancy so that the Bangladesh government can use the findings from the study in their policy, because as I know that as it is a developing country, so people don't have 100% access to the electricity. So the government is planning to establish 30 new coal-based power plant. So for this study, I applied some technique to separate out the air pollution that coming from the fossil fuel sources. The fossil fuel sources in Bangladesh are brick kilns, coal-based power plant, industries, and motor vehicles, and the pollution that coming from the biomass. So the biomass is another main sources of air pollution in Bangladesh, because people use biomass for their household cooking. Then I connected those air pollution metrics to 340,000 cardiovascular emergency department visit, about 250,000 hospital admission, and about 17,000 mortality. Then in my analysis, I found that in all three outcomes, if you look at this figure, so the red one, this is for fossil fuel, and the blue one, this is for biomass burning. And this is a kind of a dose response curve, like the y-axis, that's the response, and x-axis, that is the dose. If you see, always the slope for the fossil fuel combustion is steep. That means with the same amount of air pollution that is coming from the fossil fuel, it has higher response to our health. And in my study, I found that fossil fuel combustion derived PM2.5 had 2 to 3 times larger effect on our health compared to the pollution that coming from other sources. Then I connected the same exposure metrics to the respiratory outcome in another study, And I found pretty consistent result that the fossil fuel combustion dominates the health effect association in Dhaka, Bangladesh. So what is the key message from this study? So the one simple key message is the pollution that coming from all sources are not equally toxic. The pollution that coming from the fossil fuel sources are more toxic compared to the pollution that coming from the other sources. So is it very hard to connect it to our living experience in New Orleans or Louisiana? I don't think so, because this is a cascading area. Like it's a city surrounded by the petrochemical industries that people are, every time people are inhaling that pollution from these petrochemical industries. But unfortunately, I would say, based on my literature research, it is also an understudied reason. There is no comprehensive studies here that examine the source-specific effect of air pollution on any health outcome. So I think there is a lot of opportunity to contribute in that area to make it evident to the policymaker and to the government and also to the public, so that people understand what is driving the climate change and also what is driving the health effect association here. And these findings also has very important climate policy implication. The one is, like we all know that fossil fuel combustion is the biggest contributor to the carbon dioxide emission in the atmosphere. And the carbon dioxide is the metric for the climate change. And the findings from the study suggest that the pollution that coming from the fossil fuel combustion driving mass of the air pollution health effect association. So from the cutting down of fossil fuel combustion, we can get highest health benefit as well as highest climate benefit. So sometimes I use my PhD supervisor's quote that when we talk about the human cost of air pollution and climate change, the causes are one and same. As I mentioned that I had opportunity to work in another most climate vulnerable region. So this is California. And we know that California is prone to wildfire and also heat. There are several studies that examined the individual effect of heat and wildfire. So for this study, I came up with a new hypothesis, a novel hypothesis in a way that because in real life, we exposed to multiple exposures simultaneously. And California is a place that is prone to wildfire, and wildfire occur during hotter days. So there is a lot of chance to co-exposure extreme air pollution that coming from the wildfire and also heat. So for this study, I collected data from California Department of Public Health from 2014 to 2019. There are about 1.5 million all-cause death, about 500,000 cardiovascular death, and about 130,000 respiratory health. So in my analysis, I found very alarming results. Like if you see in the graph that in the figure that the excess risks of mortality associated with only air pollution is 5%, with only heat it's 6%. But when the co-exposure, when people co-expose to both heat and air pollution, the excess risk is 21%. So the equation is not simple. 1 + 1 is not equal to 2 in terms of air pollution and heat. When the co-exposure, it is much more greater than like 5 + 6 = 11, but in reality, it is 21. So this study received huge press attention. There was a nice editorial on this study by Dr. Patrick Kinney. He is one of the world-renowned climate and health epidemiologist. Heat wave and air pollution, a deadly combination. There were about 250 news stories on this article. Time, NBC, they picked up these articles. And the findings of the study suggest that exposure to short-term air pollution and short-term extreme heat individually associated with excess risks of mortality. But when the co-exposure, the risk is greater than the sum of the individual effect. And it has important policy implication as well. The extreme heat and extreme air pollution will worsen under climate change. To be honest, before coming to the New Orleans, I came here only 6 months last fall. So I did not have an idea about the overall scale of the impact of the wildfire in the United States. I thought the wildfire is only a problem to the West. But I think last fall, we all experienced that the March fire here, it lasted for more than 15 days. We all smelled it. We all saw the smog. When smog and fog come together, it's called smog. And it caused one of the largest casualty in the I-10 that cost more than 10 lives. So it is happening. It is happening all around us. So it will come in a larger scale in the future. So the findings of the study demonstrate the need for better intervention and adaptation policies to save life occurring during extreme heat and extreme air pollution days. Like currently, the US government has public health hazard alert that individually for air pollution and temperature, but I think it is time to combine them together, especially during extreme heat and extreme air pollution days. And also, one of the big challenges for the climate change is the building resilience in the community level. So for doing that, we can think about increasing cooling green space in the community, installing cool roof, and creating cool streets. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to discuss with the community people about these opportunities as to building to increase the resilience at the community level. And also community can provide solar powered air conditioned cooling centers. So we can also discuss about the application of the solar power, because that's the other way to cut down the fossil fuel combustion. Otherwise, if we relied on the electricity that coming from the fossil fuel combustion, maybe we are getting health benefit here, but the people living in the WIHO, there are a lot of coal-based power plant, they will be impacted. So maybe in other part of the world, they're getting benefited, but the power that coming from, like maybe in other part of the United States or other part of the world, they will be impacted by the fossil fuel combustion. And overall, I think in terms of climate change, we have to think about it's a global problem. It's not a regional problem. So currently I'm studying another deadly combination. So this is the combination of heat and relative humidity in Bangladesh. So the climate in Bangladesh is pretty same to the New Orleans. So it's a hot and humid climate. And for the study, I examined more than 500,000 cardiovascular emergency department visits. And if you look at this figure here, relative humidity expressed as percentage. So if you look at here, especially the bottom one, you can see when the relative humidity is 34 to 69, that time, the effect of heat on cardiovascular emergency department visit is 4.4. When the relative humidity is little high, from that like 69 to 76, that time the effect of heat is 6.5. When it's little more high, from 76 to 82, it's 8.2. But at the top level, when it is above 82%, it jumps to 26. So if you compare the 26, that's the normal relative humidity and extreme relative humidity. So the effect of heat jump to the fifth high. So I think now people, I think we also realize that because it is the physiology of our body. Like we all experience during humid day, like we feel suffocated because when the relative humidity is high, our body cannot cool itself through the sweat evaporation. So that aggravated the effect of the heat in our body. But why we need this study? Because we feel that bad. We need this study to make it evident to the policymaker, to the government level. Look, our feeling is we feel bad, but this is the data. Data is telling that when the relative humidity is high, the effect of heat jumped to the fifth fold from 4.4 to 26. So the findings of the study suggest that the relative humidity can synergistically modify the effect of heat on health. So the relative humidity should be taken into account in the early heat warning system to reduce the heat-related adverse health impact, especially during summertime. And the findings of the study also suggest that it is not only heat, it is relative humidity as well. So the relative humidity should be considered in combination with extreme heat in local and global climate change impact assessment and policies. And more research need to be conducted to develop targeted intervention and adaptation plans to reduce the effect of hot and humid weather conditions. And I think in that case, there's a lot of opportunity to work with the community people. If you look at here, I use the targeted intervention and adaptation because the intervention and adaptation is expensive. So we need to identify the population at risk and the community at risk so that we can start from there. Once we generate some evidence that with some intervention and adaptation, the communities or the population in these communities, they are getting benefited. They get health benefit and also the temperature reduced, then we can apply that in the broader level. So in that sense, I think there are a lot of opportunity to collaborate with the community, and I'm really so excited about this. And I want to thank the department chair and the dean to make it happen. That I'm a junior investigator here, just 6 months, but I'm seeing that it is happening here, and the community people, Angela and other people, they came here. So I think this will be a good collaboration. Yeah.
As we're transitioning to our next speaker, we have a set of questions for you. And that we'll still keep on answering or conducting a summary of your questions. So while we're going through that, I'm going to invite Angela Chalk to come. Either or together? Sure. So Kimberly Doley is again, she's the Policy and Advocacy Committee Coordinator for Waterwise Gulf South. Thanks for joining us. They can still answer the questions, right? They'll go one at a time as they. Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to spend the evening with you. My name is Kimberly Doley. I've been with Waterwise Gulf South for the last 3 years, working as the Policy and Advocacy Committee Coordinator. And I'd like to introduce you to the Waterwise Gulf South model of advancing green infrastructure and nature-based solutions through community-driven efforts. In our work, we're facing a few questions. The first is, how does our collective of community-based organizations advance nature-based solutions to combat the effects of climate change using a community ownership model, which I will explain a little bit later. And then how do we scale up our efforts to advance green infrastructure in our communities? We are starting small and we're looking to install more large-scale green infrastructure projects. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're doing that. And then how do we work with local and state government agencies and officials and other stakeholders to effectively implement our model? And that brings in additional questions like funding. How do we apply for funding? Where do we get the money to install these projects? And technical support. We're small community-based organizations working as a collective, pooling our resources, and there's government with millions of dollars and questionably, like, are they being good stewards of that money? And then technical support in terms of learning expertise around what we need to know to be able to advance and scale up green infrastructure using our model. And maintenance, how do we maintain these projects once we install them, and who's responsible ultimately? And so these are all questions we're currently exploring. WaterWise Gulf South is an umbrella organization. We partner with 6 community-based organizations. We started adding these organizations one by one over the last 8 years. WaterWise was founded in 2015 as a result of the urban water plan being released without any mention of community involvement. And so our co-founder, Jeff Supak, who wasn't able to be here this evening, he said, we need to create a community-driven model for advancing green infrastructure. And our work is to seek to enhance community resilience through addressing flooding through stormwater management, addressing urban heat island effect, and addressing the effects of climate change. We work with 6 communities listed here in Treme, the Greater Treme Consortium, and Cheryl Austin, the executive director, is here this evening. We work with the 7th Ward, Healthy Community Services. You'll hear from Dr. Chalk, the founder of Healthy Community Services, next. Upper 9th Ward, Bunny Friend Neighborhood Association, and the president is here tonight, Catherine Prevost, one of our partners. And New Orleans East, we have a green infrastructure collective in the East. They're one of the newest areas that we're working in, and New Orleans East is very large, so we're figuring out how to tackle those neighborhoods. And Holly Grove Dixon Neighborhood Association, we have Raymond Sweet representing Holly Grove here, and Lower 9th Ward Homeownership Association. And a disproportionate number of the residents in these neighborhoods live in poverty and are faced with poor environmental conditions. These neighborhoods are situated in low-lying areas below sea level, and they experience chronic flooding from a combination of runoff from impervious surfaces, aging and underfunded infrastructure, poorly maintained drainage system, and climate change. And if you've been listening to the news, reading the news lately, there's a lot of discussion around our infrastructure and the maintenance of our infrastructure right now. And in addition, institutionalized racism and its policies have led to these residents bearing a disproportionate burden of the effects of environmental degradation and climate change. According to the White House's Council on Environmental Quality and Economic Justice Screening Tool, all of the communities we partner with are considered disadvantaged, and most of them are in the 90th plus percentile for projected flood risk, lack of green space, and low life expectancy. And on top of this, the devastating repetitive effects of flooding leave these residents terrified every time it rains, every time there's a flash flood warning that comes across text messages on NOLA Ready. And, they don't understand what this means for their property losses and getting to work, getting to doctor's appointments. All these things are impacting their mental, emotional, and physical well-being. And we don't have data on these impacts because these are everyday rain events and not declared emergencies. And so most of the loss doesn't meet their insurance deductibles. And so the information and the economic data and the health impacts don't get recorded. And because these residents live this every day, they're intimately familiar with these conditions. The WaterWise Gulf South model is founded on the fact that residents are experts in their communities, and therefore they need to drive the change of advancing green infrastructure in their communities. And we've seen what happens when community members are excluded from the process of creating their own solutions and implementing their own solutions. The results are rejection of what's imposed upon them, lack of understanding around the imposed solutions, no sense of ownership, lack of knowledge or responsibility for maintaining the interventions. And so our model is based on the spectrum of community engagement to ownership, which was developed by Rosa Gonzales of Facilitating Power. And I just want to show you this spectrum. it starts at ignore, where communities are completely left out, and then moves to communities are informed, they're, given flyers or fact sheets, they're consulted, asked for their opinion, and then further along, they are involved more intimately, their collaborative efforts, and then community ownership is deferring to the community to be able to implement their own solutions. And so we move along the spectrum in our process. We start with the beginning stages of engagement, informing and consulting with WaterWise Neighborhood Champion Program, which is a 101 workshop on green infrastructure. We teach the basics, and we survey residents about their issues and their prior knowledge of GI. And then we go on a green infrastructure project tour where we show completed projects. We do a tour of the Sewage and Water Board pumping station, just to give them a sense of like, this is how everything works together. And then implementation of projects. When residents complete the WaterWise training program, they're able to apply for a project on their property. So they get to see green infrastructure in action on their property. And then practical learning in action. They're invited to come and help with maintenance. They're invited to come and learn about the different installations as we install them. And so Dr. Chalk will talk about how we've built this program and more specifics of it. I just wanted to give you a brief framework of it. And moving along the spectrum, we've started to build our capacity and grow and scale up our efforts by involving and collaborating with and deferring to residents through visioning sessions, where we invite residents who've learned about green infrastructure to come and identify where they see flooding in their neighborhoods, where they want to see green infrastructure projects, and what type of interventions they would like to see. And so through this visioning process, we've identified over 120 large-scale projects within the communities. And these are in our neighborhood lookbooks, which are on our website. So you can see all the projects that have been identified. And we've recently convened a committee of our neighborhood champions, a smaller subset of them, called a Visioning Session Committee. And they are going through a learning process with us to help us understand how to scale up these projects. And get them to shovel ready so that they're ready for funding once we decide what exactly we're going to do and have convened a team to help get those projects ready to be implemented. And we're realizing we didn't consider this at first, but this is a community science effort. And, we're all becoming researchers, which if you told us that a few years ago, we would have told you were crazy. So we're going on a deep dive learning journey. We're engaging with engineers to learn about hydraulic and hydrologic modeling to determine if our current projects are making an impact, if our envisioned projects will make an impact, and whether we need to scale up our projects. And then we're learning how to build capacity to take on such an undertaking, because we are normally out in the field doing projects. We're not learning about engineering modeling. And so this is really causing us to stretch ourselves into new areas, which is great. And we're working with landscape designers to get our projects to shovel ready with designs and construction documents so that we can more easily apply for funding and be ready with teams in place when the funding arrives. We're partnering with organizations like Earth Economics to track the ecosystem service benefits of our installed projects. And then we're building relationships with organizations like Tulane that will help us to rethink how academia and community work together. And the outcomes that we're seeking, besides installation and funding and maintenance of projects, are about community building and investing in our people. We are determining how to continue to engage with, involve, and prepare residents to lead and drive the process from start to finish, with us as facilitators and them as decision makers. And then we want to be able to pay our residents so that they are compensated for their expertise and involve them at every level so that they see where they want to invest their time and energy. And we provide resources to invest in them and their development. And we want to help build the community's technical expertise so that we can hire within the community and begin to build a circular economy. And I think the best part about this collective and how we work together is that these organizations were not part of an application process to become part of WaterWise. They all approached WaterWise and invited WaterWise into their communities. And so this is how we work. This is how we operate. And it's been really fulfilling to take such a deep dive into the community process in this way. And Dr. Chalk will talk a little bit more about how we work together.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. Yes, I do need help getting it back. So just go back. Okay. Okay, thank you. Right, I always have problems with this. So I am Dr. Angela Chalk, founder and executive director for Healthy Community Services. Let me start by saying that I came to this whole arena of green infrastructure by way of a dare with Jeff Supak, because when he was talking about green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, I had not a clue of what he was talking about. And so I remember the conversation vividly on my driveway, and I told Jeff, I said, well, if you want me to believe it, you're gonna have to put it here. And so he said, okay. And that's what happened. This month, the bioswale made 10 years old, and that's how I keep track of it over time. So the bioswale is 10 years old. At that time, we didn't even know how to calculate bioretention soil to be able to put into the project. So we have a picture somewhere of a molehill. So I think that that was the highest elevation in the city of New Orleans when we put in that project, because we didn't know how to even calculate bioretention soil. Fast forward, we have become the experts in green infrastructure with our communities and using nature-based solutions. I could have never imagined being on this stage talking about resiliency, stormwater management, urban ag, and coastal resiliency, all at the intersection of public health and climate health. But here I am. And so what I want each of you to take away from this is that we all have a role to play, both professionally and personally, because we live and work in these cities. We pray in this city. And so what Kimberly talked to you about earlier with us is working as a collective. We are a collective of 6 African-American women that are leading community-based organizations in which we live, work, and serve in. And so through our work as defined by the Environmental Justice Index, we are considered as disadvantaged communities, but by no means are we disadvantaged to the point that people don't understand that we have a rich and vibrant culture and social norms. And so in working with communities, and you're going to see that highlighted in bold, as academic institutions, we need you all to work with us, not do something to us, not be extractive of what our norms are and the expertise that we have, and respect that, just as we respect those folks who are the technical people, the scientists. We know that we need the science to marry with what we're experiencing in everyday life. This is real for us. It's not numbers. It is real. And while we know that we need the metrics to be able to prove what it is that we're saying, remember first and foremost as public health practitioners that you are working for the public, and the public are real individuals that suffer these impacts. And so throughout our learning journey, we realized that the systematic biases, racism, and the political determinants of health have left our communities disinvested in. And so how do we get the amenities that other communities have? Because we're certainly deserving of it. We're working people, we go to work. And so why should someone have to live with this after a rainstorm? This person can't even get in and out of their house. They have to make a makeshift plank. This is real. This is a real picture of a resident living in the 7th Ward. And so all of that affects our social determinants of health. And so how do we do this? What actions do we take? We engage, educate, and empower residents to make those decisions regarding resilience. Resilience is defined by the community's needs. We know what we need in our community, and we have to marry that with the science. And so our organizations are 501c3 organizations, and we have been able to build our organizational capacity by philanthropic support. The Justice Fund initiative that was signed by President Biden that has unlocked a lot of funding opportunities for us, using having access to federal grants. But most importantly, the participatory community science, to know that it's a real science and that we can work with academic institutions. And above all, leaving tangible assets in those communities that we live. Long after we're gone, those assets will be there. For instance, the bottle brush trees. We've planted over 1,000 trees in our community. So long after we're native vegetation. So let me stress that, native vegetation, because they're able to work with our environment. So long after we're gone, these trees will tell the story of what happened at the time when we realized that we had so much heat in our communities because they were disinvested. And so a bottle brush here, what you see here, will grow to be 9 feet tall and provide shade and help clear out some of those air pollutants that my colleague spoke of earlier. Again, this is the bioswale when it was first put in. So these were 4-inch plants. It's 10 years now. Those plants are 6 feet high. And what we learned and discovered in the process of using native vegetation, we know that the roots are as deep as the plants are high. And so what interventions are we using? As working together, we're able to share resources, as Kimberly Doley mentioned earlier, and we're not competing for funds, because while there's a lot of money available now, we still have to prepare grants and to not be able to compete and make a stronger application by showing our collective works together has proven well for us to be able to both increase organizational capacity and to leave those assets in the way of more resilient interventions, creating a circular economy by creating jobs, by providing professional development. All of the folks that work on our projects are nationally certified green infrastructure practitioners, or they've started their own small businesses that allows them to work on these interventions and learn as they grow their business. So a little bit about our portfolio. We're managing, as Kimberly mentioned earlier, we have 175 neighborhood champions throughout the network, over 185 projects that have been completed, with an additional 120 that are shovel ready. We've planted over 1,000 trees. I know I've planted with my organization 794 in the 7th Ward, and another 50 are going in. And please ask me later how I know that number. But the most important thing is that we're managing 300 gallons of stormwater per rain event. And that those projects, real and proposed, have an ecosystem value of $19.3 million. And so to philanthropists or funders, that's almost a 38-to-1 range of 38-to-1 to 40-to-1 dollar invested in our organizations. So that's a good rate of return on your investment. But this particular project, when we talk about the community-driven engagement and spectrum model, this project is located at the northwest corner of St. Bernard and North Claiborne. I'll have to get my directions together. And this was when it was first installed. Right now, it's in phase 2. So if you pass by that intersection, and I know that Sean said that earlier that he passed by and has been watching the transformation of phase 2. But what's important about Vision to Reality Stormwater Management Park was that it was the vision of the residents that made this project a reality. And we were able to put that project in with funding from the Institute of Sustainable Communities, along with funds leveraged from the Kresge Foundation. Also, at the time, we did not realize that this park not only serves the residents of the 7th Ward, but it's on a hurricane evacuation route. So it's servicing residents of Plaquemine, St. Bernard, and Orleans who travel through this corridor. So what's the link? The link, of course, is improve air quality by using native vegetation. We're able to reduce surface temperatures by reforestation of an urban canopy. We lost over 100,000 trees during Hurricane Katrina. And guess where most of those trees were at? They were in communities of color that are disinvested. We're able to improve water quality of Lake Pontchartrain because these plants, as I stated earlier about their roots, they get as deep as the roots, deep as the plants are high. But with the plants that you see out front, those are native vegetations. Those roots will be able to infiltrate and penetrate into the water table, thus helping to improve the water quality that then transfers out to Lake Pontchartrain. The other connections is the sustained behavior and mental health changes due to repetitive flooding. I can't tell you that if you live in this city or you live in one of the communities, that when it says it's going to rain, what do? Do you move your car? Do you go get the kids from school? Do you pull out rain boots? What is it? And if it's happening in the middle of the night, do I get up or do I let my car flood? And as Kimberly said, there is no measurement or data for that because it's not a declared emergency. And then, of course, we lose time from work and school to be able to recover from these events. And so again, the targeted areas that we work in are the 7th Ward, Treme, Upper 9th Ward, Holly Grove Dixon, Lower 9th Ward, and New Orleans East. Now, what does that mean? That means that these areas were identified by us, but working with Waterwise, Gulf South. But we know that according to Professor Campanella, there's not one bowl in this city. There are 12 bowls in this city. So North Claiborne Avenue being at 0 elevation, and then depending on where you live at with the ridges, the Esplanade Ridge, the Metairie Ridge, the Gentilly Ridge. If you live within those areas, you're more likely, or the Broadmoor Ridge, you're more likely to live in one of those 12 bowls throughout the city. You all travel this city. You know the streets before it rains, which ones you need to travel down or which ones you can drive down the center so that your car doesn't get flooded. You're even becoming the experts as to where the potholes are at so that when you don't see them when it rains, you know, oh, there's a pothole here. So we are the experts, going back to being community driven. And I won't go through the spectrum. I just want you to realize that this spectrum is important. And when Kim and I were putting these slides together, we did not talk about this at all. And so to find out that, because we believe in this spectrum, so to know that we were on the same wavelength without even having communicated about that we were like, yeah, that's what we do. But if you don't know about this community spectrum of engagement and ownership, I really implore you to learn more about it and how it can help you in your work, because you get a better understanding of what people are experiencing in their communities through their lens and not just through an academic lens. And so what can you do? One, respect communities. I don't go into anyone else's communities imposing my will upon them. I deliver the information based on facts and science. People are able to make the decisions for themselves. And you can do something personally and professionally, whether it's planting a native tree or planting a native plant. You can do something. Engage with youth or a young person, because our youth are looking at us and they're depending on us. And the careers and goals that were, and I was speaking about this earlier, having just returned from Louisville, seeing a 160-year-old 160-year-old pumping station that was established in 1860. And the architecture of it, that building is still in place. And so someone was thinking far enough in the future to think that we can't build just for today, but we have to build for the future. And that's where we are as public health practitioners, to be able to ensure that future generations we can lead the path to them, that they'll understand what their role is to make sure that we live in a resilient communities. And so I always end with the phrase from Margaret Mead, and I believe this to be true, and that's never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can make a change in the world. So what will be your change professionally, personally, and as academics? Thank you all so much.
And we have Angela's question here as well, too. So what barriers exist to public health researchers and practitioners fully engaging with residents across the community engagement spectrum of participation? So if you guys want to answer that question, and it's time for a 7th inning stretch, so everybody can get up and do that. I was looking for some music we could put on it, just looking for that now. And this is Kimberly's question. Oh. How can the field of public health better partner with residents to demonstrate that community science and community participatory research are valued? So. All right, we're coming to the home stretch here. We have Sarah Michaels next from the Department of Tropical Medicine and Infectious Disease. And after that, we'll have Sean Fowler from architecture. And then last we have Stephen Murphy. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, it's a daunting task to talk about mosquitoes, vector-borne disease, and how that intersects with the environmental and climatic changes, but we'll try to pull that off in 5 minutes or so. But vector-borne diseases really emerge when we have this complex association between environmental factors and behavioral and social factors. And so you're probably most familiar locally with something like West Nile virus. Do I have a pointer? Ooh. Which is an enzootic vector-borne disease where birds are infected, mosquitoes feed on birds, become infected, and then feed on us and transfer the virus. But the big viruses that we're concerned about are those that have urban epidemic cycles. And the vectors for those Aedes aegypti, Aedes albopictus, which I'll talk more about, are present in New Orleans, are expanding and driven by climatic factors. And of course, that's the concern we have for vector-borne disease emergence. So mosquitoes, not only mosquitoes, as arthropod vectors are driven by this climate-induced environmental changes, things like ticks, you're probably familiar with Lyme disease and the expansion of Lyme disease, kissing bugs that transmit Chagas disease, and we have local cases in the southern US as well. So we have both this increasing risk of zoonotic vector-borne diseases and this reemergence of diseases that we have been more or less under control, at least in our part of the world. And the challenge with these diseases in particular is we don't have many tools. They're very limited options for vaccines. And so primarily what we rely on is reducing individuals' exposure to infected vectors. And I'll talk a little bit more about my two favorite mosquito species, but the bottom maps are the abundance and potential range for these species, Aedes aegypti in blue and Aedes albopictus in greenish yellow, and how that we've seen this optimize a wider and wider range of the US and put potentially more people at risk. So these two mosquito species, Aedes aegypti, the yellow fever mosquito, which has been a longtime resident of New Orleans, and Aedes albopictus just below it, the Asian tiger mosquito, which has come import tires in the mid-'80s and also very probably abundant in your yards and around your homes here. But they are competent vectors of things like dengue and chikungunya and Zika. And those diseases in and of themselves are really surging in incidence globally and severity of human infections. In fact, over the last 20 years, we've had a 10-fold increase in dengue incidence, and we surpassed 5 million cases last year. Just last month, Puerto Rico declared a state of public health emergency for dengue, which again increases the risk of infected travelers returning and spreading those diseases locally. And I've heard that CDC is also looking to declare a larger public health emergency around that in the coming weeks. But these vectors are driven by environmental they're driven by environmental factors like temperature and rainfall, as well as anthropogenetic landscape factors. So how urbanized an area is, vegetated, our land use and coverage. And so all of that has been linked to abundance and distribution of these two species. And they have this special strategy. They lay eggs, they're very desiccation resistant. They lay them inside containers. And as those containers are filled with water, typically rainfall, they can hatch and they can hatch over a long time. So they really optimize a lot of the containers around our homes, the ones that we manage, as well as ones that are discarded. And what temperature in specific does is it increases how quickly these mosquitoes develop. So typically in the hot summer months here, they go from egg to adult in about little as a week. So the hotter it is, the more quickly that development cycle happens, as well as if they were infected with mosquitoes, how quickly they come from becoming infected to be able to transmit the virus to a new host. And again, I have to echo my other speakers who've touched on a lot of these issues. So thinking about what are those intersections with environmental issues here in New Orleans. Our state is either the rainiest or second rainiest, takes turns with Hawaii on a given year. For the amount of rainfall in New Orleans is the rainiest city in the rainiest state in the country, with nearly 63.5 inches of rain on an annual basis, with the exception of last year, which was slightly lower. So we have abundant rainfall. This rainfall does not, as you know, doesn't fall equally. So we have intense precipitation events where we have more than 2 inches in a single day that would work very well to fill up all of those container habitats in and around our homes. And then we have longer periods of drought between these rain events that dry out those containers, create the opportunity for those eggs then to desiccate and be ready to hatch during the next rain event. And New Orleans has often been ranked first or by a few different metrics as the most intense urban heat island, and that 70% of our residents live in areas that are often 8 degrees or hotter than average than the rest of the city. And I see some people from the health department here, and I know they do a lot of work locally to measure that, both get good quality environmental data within our city and look at those differences among neighborhoods. And I know that's a big room for growth. But communities in the southern US are at high risk of introduction of these vector-borne diseases. We have warm climate, high humidity, rainfall to support abundant vector populations. And then, as our speakers have also discussed, we have high rates of urban poverty. And because of that, that can increase the likelihood of exposure to these vectors and then limit the ability for diagnosis and healthcare of those infections. And so when we just think about all these factors that drive mosquito populations, we also have to look at the social, economic, and behavioral factors of individuals and how and when they're exposed. So there's been some studies in other southern cities, so Baltimore and DC, looked at how do we determine highest risk and abundance? What are those social economic factors that drive mosquito populations? And so in low income neighborhoods in those cities, higher mosquito densities were found and greater numbers of discarded containers that had larvae developing mosquitoes present in them. But as mentioned already, New Orleans is really distinctive where we have our historic discriminatory practices, how that intersects with our pre-existing landscape of environmental risk. So areas that flood more have less ability to respond to those type of events. And just a reminder that a third of New Orleanians live in poverty. We have a high proportion, so about 1.25% have houses without AC. So that's about 2,000 homes across the city that have no air conditioning. And then you have a lot of low income residents that are reluctant to use any AC or fans because of high energy costs. So increasing the likelihood of exposure, utilizing having doors and windows open or spending time outside instead of having AC access. And then just to add to that, we also have a high proportion of individual homes without access to piped water. So that might lead to water storage or other way that water is used around the home. So again, Baltimore and DC looked at income as a way to understand where risk was greatest within the city. There's, I would say it's not necessarily a new tool, but it's a more applied tool. So it's developed after Katrina. CDC and ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, created a social vulnerability index. And so that utilizes 16 census variables with different categories that quantify what poverty and vulnerability is really due to. So lack of vehicle access, crowded housing, and language barriers and, ability to kind of be able to respond to a disease outbreak or other external stresses like a natural disaster. So we utilized this kind of new metric to look at a more comprehensive understanding of what communities would be at greatest risk. And so I see Brenda Carter's here today, and so thank you. This is a work that he's been doing on focusing on what those other factors are that lead to more abundant mosquito populations and therefore could translate to higher risk of disease transmission. So he looked at SVI rankings across the city and found that Infectious and Egypti were positively correlated with SVI ranking, and that Egypti was also correlated with measures of urban heat. So somewhat what we expected, but really kind of being able to understand, again, if we're looking for planning or positioning assets or lending support, this is a way to quantify areas at greatest risk. And so to tie it back in sort of with green infrastructure, with how we manage water, one of the tools that one of the projects we've also done is finding out what those abundant containers are around our homes. So everywhere you live, you have slightly different containers that we manage or leave unmanaged that fill with rainwater that contribute to mosquito populations. And so here we find lots of containers, unsurprisingly, around the home. A lot of times those things are managed like flower pots or pet dishes or fountains. And albeit rarely, we do also find things like rain barrels that can contribute. But what I wanted to bring up is that we do have amazing organizations, WaterWise among them, Greenlight NOLA within that understand this relationship we have with water and with mosquitoes and how we can create green infrastructure that excludes mosquitoes and doesn't contribute to mosquito abundance. So I just wanted to kind of point out that Greenlight in particular, which I've been lucky to work with service learning students, has a closed system for their rain barrels, which doesn't allow mosquitoes entry and therefore doesn't collect mosquito eggs inside. They also advocate for the use of mosquito dunks that prevents mosquitoes growing and developing in those containers. And I just wanted to say that when I was with the city of New Orleans, we worked to make sure that our information looked like what our residents' homes looked like, had the containers that were most abundant in our yards. So it was messaging that made sense to our constituents. Just as a conclusion, climatic changes are impacting vector populations, especially mosquitoes. And we've had this global incidence of vector-borne disease incidents and this ongoing risk of returning infected travelers. And socially vulnerable populations are under greatest threat due to mosquito abundance in those areas and the potential or the greater potential for exposure to mosquitoes. And so finding those effective community engagement methods is key. Getting people to identify and understand where mosquitoes are developing, understand the risk of arboviral transmission. And this is challenging. So we're also used to West Nile. It's not it's not something that maybe motivates people to look around their homes and look for these environments, but certainly these other diseases and their potential for emergence might be it. Some other work that I didn't quite get to include is we're also working on canine heartworm. So apparently Americans spend more on their pets' care than their own medical care. And maybe this could motivate people to look around their homes to reduce the risk of their pets becoming infected. But just in general, that any efforts that we do to mitigate and live with the water and the changes in precipitation around our home also is mindful of mosquito risk and doesn't create additional mosquito habitat. Thank you. And I think I have questions as well. So are you familiar with SVI as a public health tool? So that's social vulnerability index. Oh, good. Oh, okay. All right. 50-50 here. I don't know how long do we let this go? Okay. We'll leave it at 50-50. Slightly. Oh. All right, I'm gonna move on. Did you learn anything new about mosquito? Oh, there were not options there. Okay, we're gonna skip this one. We'll just go to this one. So how concerned are you about emerging vector-borne disease? And I think that's I have a why, but we wanted to. I think. John. I'm gonna go ahead and let you introduce yourself.
I'm sorry. Wait. Good evening. Thanks for sticking with us. My name is Sean Fowler. I'm a research assistant professor in the School of Architecture. graduate of the program, and I work in, like many of the people here, in urbanism, infrastructure, architecture, public space, and how that interacts with public health and climate change, particularly in the Gulf South and in New Orleans. Currently, this work is part of the New Orleans Public Space Project, as part of the School of Architecture's Center for Climate Change, because New Orleans faces compounding and interrelated challenges in the built environment, accelerated and exacerbated by changing climates. Coastal and river cities like New Orleans are the vanguards of climate change, and solutions studied and tested and proven here, vital to addressing these challenges and elsewhere in the future, but also vital to the way that we can live, thrive, and enjoy our beautiful city here. And to this end, the work that I'm doing across several, the work that we're doing across several different categories asks how and whether public spaces in New Orleans can be redesigned to perform better, to be more safe and livable, and to help communities thrive in ways they don't currently, as I think many of the fellow speakers have addressed already this evening. There's plenty of different impacts of climate change on people living in New Orleans and our communities, impacts of urban heat that are escalating, impacts of air and noise pollution that are escalating, impacts of drinking water as pollution pours down the Mississippi River, falls into it, and crawls out of the Gulf of Mexico as well. But there's also indirect impacts from direct and indirect impacts from flooding, from subsidence, which take those already low-lying neighborhoods and drive them lower as drainage and pumping continues, from the distribution of healthy and sustainable food access across neighborhoods and communities, leading to food deserts in some of the most hard-hit areas, of power outages, which exacerbates many of the challenges dealing with urban heat and other factors that further challenge and add to chronic and compounding stresses in what are already some of the most impacted neighborhoods of the city. But these climate impacts also just address general wellness measures as well, including access to public transit, access to green space and ecology outside of the urban heat impacts, and the livability of the public spaces that are inequitably distributed across our city, along with the maintenance costs that continue to escalate, as I think we've all seen in the news over the last several weeks, months, and years, from the costs of levees to the costs of the pump systems to the costs of the streets, and the way that these will continue to inequitably impact our cities. So the work that that we're working on right now is currently involving a research studio of graduate and undergraduate students looking at these factors through a series of lenses, from research on the health impacts of urban heat and pollution, chronic stresses, human environmental impacts of urban ecology, and how all of these are distributed across the city of New Orleans, from the pollution and from both the air and noise pollution maps you can see off to the left there, to, as Sarah had just finished mentioning, how that spatializes across New Orleans, indicated here with the Social Vulnerability Index map of Orleans Parish, including the fact that the most impacted communities are also the communities of the most non-white residents, are the communities with the lowest income levels, the communities with the highest indices of social vulnerability, and the fact that these are compounded, particularly in the history of the development of New Orleans, with those communities that were first settled and developed after the mid-1800s, and continuing on to through the post-war period, and how the city developed over that period of time. The New Orleans Public Space Project is an extension of previous urbanism design and infrastructure research that's been done both in and outside of the Tulane University School of Architecture. It's part of an ongoing design studio that I'm helping to teach right now, based on some of the thesis research that I did here. It's a multidisciplinary research project looking at collaborating with both different disciplines here in Tulane University, but also with community groups throughout the city of New Orleans. And asks as a sort of final takeaway, as something to leave with: how can these neighborhoods be designed to create healthier spaces for the most vulnerable communities in an equitable way, which improves the quality of life in the parish for all residents, but tries to avoid some of the pitfalls and challenges that have led to the current path dependence that's shaped the city of New Orleans as it exists today. So thank you all. And I think I've got a couple brief questions. Asking folks whether their streets flood during rainstorms. No, of course not, right? We'll all move to that block, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair initial question. All right, well, it looks like that's settled down a little bit. And then trying to understand the amount of shade, trees, and other features that help to cool the urban heat island in people's neighborhoods on a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is the most shady and 1 is the least provided shade. And then asking whether y'all live within a 10-minute walk of a park, because that's another item that our research and our students are finding is particularly inequitably distributed across the city, is access to quality green space as opposed to something called a park that just happens to be a bit of blacktop with a chain link fence around it. All right, well, I believe that's the last of the questions that I had. So thank y'all. Appreciate y'all being here this evening.
Thank you, Sean. And we're looking forward to getting your next installment on the projects that you're working on in the studio that you're working on with the grad students. So keep us informed on that, please. Yeah. And so our last speaker for tonight is Stephen Murphy, and Stephen is a faculty member of my department, and he is the director of our disaster management program. So Stephen, thanks.
All right. Thanks for hanging in there, everybody. Mine's probably going to be a little bit more applied. So maybe we can leave on a lighter note with all of this data heavy and some of the things that we're doing and some of the things that we're looking at as possible solutions. So I will say that the tree conversation in question is a good one. When I moved to my new homes, the matriarch and patriarch of the neighborhood were very upset with me that I did not remove these large trees in my yard. And I was like, no, we don't want to do that. That defeats the purpose. But they're still mad at me to this day. So anyway, so I'm Stephen Murphy. I'm the director of the Disaster Management Masters of Public Health program, and also am the director of the Public Health Training Center, the Region 6, which is part of the School of Public Health, and where TALON is the mnemonic that we always use: Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, New Mexico, the 5 states that represent Region 6. If you're from Georgia, like me originally, that's region 4, right? We have 10 regions across the United States. We're region 6. And that's a huge public health training center that is funded, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So that's where I'm going to spend a little bit of time, what some of the applied mechanisms are to take some of the information and some of the research from the previous folks that have talked to you all tonight and look at some of the applied things that we're doing here as well. So obviously we don't need to talk about this as much. There is a link between health and climate impacts. That is quite obvious. Being last in this rodeo, I think it's quite obvious. We don't need to discuss that any longer. But again, looking at that HRSA funded Region 6 Public Health Training Center, and then one that we have now for public health emergency preparedness and response to take that to another level. The COVID-19 pandemic pretty much presented a lot of complex situations, a lot of complex failures as well across the globe, but especially in the United States. And so this FEPR funding is going to help address, or should I say, is going to attempt to address some of that. Again, that will be regionally based as well. So there will be 10 of those. We've talked about this, so I don't really need to spend a whole lot of time on this slide. We all get the idea. So there's vectors, there's different diseases that can come from said vectors, wildfires. Yes, we had wildfires, and then the super fog incident, which is not the first time we've had something like that. And, you know, we talk about some of the wildfires in my class, and I could not even see the Superdome from City Hall during the 2011 marsh fire in New Orleans East. That's how bad it was. And you could not see Audubon Park from Tulane's Gibson Hall, if that puts it in perspective. You literally could not see it. That's how dense the smoke was from a 2011 marsh fire. So yes, it does happen. And it happens for a variety of reasons, but climate changing is certainly a driver of that. So looking at a call here for public health to meet some of the 21st century, there's different iterations of things like this. But looking at the capacity, looking at our ability to overcome some of this, looking at the ability for our health and our frontline providers and public health and healthcare specifically, the Public Health 3.0, you can see that building capacity in public health is an essential function. And that's something we have to keep in mind because we had a mass exodus in public health. A lot of the institutional knowledge, a lot of the actual workforce is leaving, early retirement, maybe burnout, an aging public health workforce as well. And so we have to keep a pulse on that. And that's a lot of what we're going to try to do as well, to take that applied approach and help professional development, but also we're in the School of Public Health. So we actually help in graduate education and undergraduate education. Got to throw the plug in there. But nonetheless, we have to address some of these things. We have to be aware of it. We have to actually acknowledge it and recognize it and not just ignore it and overlook it. So again, looking at what we do in the applied space for the Region 6 Public Health Training Center. So how do we come up with what we do? We do a needs assessment every other year. We do a needs assessment pretty much every year, but a really formal one with public health wins, PH wins as well, will be part of our program this year as well. So be a little bit of a force multiplier to try to understand what some of the gaps are, what some of the needs are that are out there in the public health and healthcare workspace. So we also look at SWOT analyses, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for those unfamiliar with that, taking the business language into the field here and looking at what some of our public health infrastructure is actually like, how we can actually apply some of what we learn in the research community, how we can apply some of what we learn in the practitioner community and kind of synergistically apply it and become a force multiplier. How can we actually overcome some of the noted threats, weaknesses, but also capitalize on some of those opportunities and strengths. And the FIG grantees there is the Public Health Infrastructure Grant, the largest ever sinking of money into the public health system with President Biden coming out of COVID-19. And so a lot of the federal funding that goes into some of these folks, and I see some of my health department folks that have been involved in this, some of the SWOT analyses that came out of those in the regional spaces have also indicated professional development and concern about the current threat and the current landscape of their aging and retiring workforce. So we have to keep this going. Everything we learn, we have to push it back into fortifying and becoming a stronger and more widespread workforce. We also get this from a lot of our open discussions across leadership in the states. So we're quite heavily leaning on those leaders in health departments and public health spaces. So your health officers, your public health emergency preparedness folks, your public health training folks, those that are actually involved in the health departments, education and professional development space, HR. So we lean on that kind of practitioner. We have steering committees as well. Obviously, we can't do anything without a steering committee and a couple of steering committees within those steering committees. So we actually leverage a lot of what has been said in exchanging of those ideas and information. What works here may not work perfectly in another space, but it can be applied. You can adapt it. We got to be careful with how we do that, but it's one of those things that we can actually bring to the table and want to keep a pulse on that as well. We have some partnerships here that I'll talk a little bit more about, so I won't spend time on this slide. So the regional public health training center is really something that's meeting the need. We like to say that we're meeting a need that's been well understood, well communicated to us. Over the years, we've developed 227 online, publicly available, free to anyone who wants to take them 24/7, 365 days a year. We have folks in really Vietnam taking classes about our hurricane response. And so this is globally accessible. I don't know how many people realize that, but we have about 70,000 users right now registered on our system. Again, publicly facing, all you got to do is make a sign up, register for it, make your own little, you can track your transcripts. So you just really make your own portal there and you can go through and take different courses. Now, this is really an important piece that anybody can take these, but we also look at what the needs might be of a health department or a public health agency, and we can actually come to an agreement. Well, you have a need for X. Well, we did a course like this in 2012. Maybe we can update that course with new case studies and things of that nature that will get you what it is you need. Or we go back to the drawing board and we actually develop a new class. We have about 8 courses that will be probably live between now and the end of this calendar year that haven't been up there before. So we do come up with new material, even though it's 227 currently, but we also go back to the drawing board, or should I say update some of those without going back to the drawing board. We have about 200,000 plus course completion certificates over the years. So it's not something that's just there for the fun of it. People actually use it and complete courses. They don't just go in there and get ideas. They actually take these courses. So we have a lot of registered users. We have a lot of courses. We also complete these courses. And so these are nice professional development things. Sometimes we can partner with CEUs, whatever continuing education units you need, whichever field it is. Now that's sometimes a cost barrier, but sometimes we can work with you on that. And interestingly enough, in a 2.5-3 year span here, there are nearly 19,000 public health emergency preparedness and response specific courses that are on that training center, hours alone, that were taken during that COVID-19 pandemic. So we like to think that it's an applied piece, that it's an important piece, and there may be a gap there in our public health, healthcare, and peripheral workforces that we need to be aware of. So a few more things that we do here. We've partnered with the CDC, received funding from the CDC with a hurricane response hub. Yes, that's one of the most obvious crises or threats that we have. I know Dr. Gonzales' slide says what these other threats are, but it was actually outside of tropical storms and tropical systems. So I think that one's first and foremost. It is fueled by climate change. Obviously, we might not be seeing an increased number of storms, but we're certainly seeing an increased number of major storms. And the rapid intensification is a very big concern when it comes to pulling the trigger for mandatory evacuations. We might not any longer have the time that we thought we did to get the assets in and to actually get out of Dodge quick. But the Hurricane Response Hub was a nice little project that we did for Louisiana and for Texas. There were 3, it was following 2017 hurricane season when those 3 massive storms, Irma, Maria, and Harvey struck the United States, but there were 5 awardees. We were 2 of the 5. We won 2 awards out of those 5, I should say. And what you can see here that 12 trainings were developed on the learning management system that we have now, and 1,300 course completions for a total of 16,000 plus hours of training in the last 2 years alone. So these are very important to Texas and Louisiana, but they're not only appropriate for Texas and Louisiana. Anybody can take them. The state of New York actually onboards and continues their training for our medical special needs sheltering training for their own health department. So it is not limited to those in Region 6. It is not limited to those in those states. Anybody can take them, but you'll see some familiar language if you're taking Louisiana-based classes or courses, I should say. Another one that's really important here that we've talked a little bit about is the climate change and how that might be an exacerbating threat space, if you will, existential threat. Our mental health, right? We're stressed about all these things. Our fellow presenter was talking about the rain and how many times you have to actually think about going out and moving your car just because it might thunderstorm overnight. How many times I have to medicate my dog because I'm worried he's going to freak out overnight, but then it doesn't, but then he will the day I don't, right? So it's these things we have to constantly think about. And it's putting us potentially at greater risk. And so Project Retain is a collaboration with the School of Social Work, and it's really on the heels of COVID-19 and worker burnout, compassion fatigue, and things of that nature that we saw on the front line of public health and healthcare. But I think it's appropriate to really tie into the climate change space because that's going to be a continued issue that we face, whether it's an infectious disease outbreak. It may be a vector-borne. It might be a spillover event that's due to increased temperatures around. It might be continued presence of hurricanes. June 1st resonates with everybody here for a very obvious reason. And I'd say it's more impactful here than it is anywhere else in the country if you think about that June 1st date on an annual basis, right? And so we have to be aware of this. And so some of the trainings that we're going to be developing from this project is looking at where these frontline workers tend to be burning out and how we can alleviate some of that potential stressor and take that into a training for everyone to then take and help bolster our ability to overcome some of those things. And again, the public health emergency preparedness and response is something we're doing now. It's a work plan development planning stage of a CDC grant that's regionally based, really looking at what the needs are in the healthcare space, in the public health space, in the K through 12 space, in the tribal communities, on the border issues in Region 6. All of these are required partners by the CDC that we've successfully approached and brought into the steering committee of this grant. Actually, I get in trouble when I say that word. It's the regional coordinating body. It's not a steering committee. But nonetheless, those are the folks that are driving it. And I know Meredith and the audience here is part of that team. But regardless, we're trying to understand what these focus areas are that are of greater concern. Whether it's data modernization, information sharing, whether it's communication strategies, whether it's the ability to mass vaccinate, whatever these strategies are that the CDC has handed down to us to try to then prioritize. That's what we're looking at doing now. And it's been a successful thing so far, and we're excited about what the end of it is going to look like. So again, continuing to meet this is a true essential function of public health. The Tulane Center for Applied Environmental Public Health is a little bit of an umbrella entity that actually has all these projects funneled through it. So we've got various outlets here, looking at the Retain project, looking at the Public Health Training Center and the FEPR. But again, we are looking very strongly at integrating with our new faculty member focused directly on climate and health, reorganizing and rearranging our MPH program to more explicitly address some of these big data issues, as well as some of the climate issues that we're facing as a country and a globe. And so hopefully that will then materialize into, again, a force multiplier upon graduation for the future of our field. And I think that was, yes, Dr. Gonzales is up next. So I do not have any questions that y'all can answer. So you're free from that. But thank you very much for staying around.
So, and I just wanted to, for those of you that stayed to the end here, I wanted to actually find out if any of you had any questions that we could actually start this off. And there's a lot of information we got, so I appreciate you sticking with us all this time. Oh, thank you.
I want to have a brief discussion about mosquitoes and its impact on, not its mosquitoes impact, but the impact of blight on mosquitoes and systems and policies that allow folks to keep junk and trash around their homes. Do you know if there's any work around that? Creating policies that actually help people in other cities, because it's not one here, in other cities that help code enforcement enforce things based on trash that holds standing waters that kind of allow
Yeah.
for breeding spaces.
Yeah, and there's a lot there to the question. So I briefly mentioned I previously worked for the city of New Orleans in mosquito control, so I'm very familiar with the issue that you're describing. And I see some of my fellow people that have worked and continue to work with the city are here as well. And so I think I know 311 can be frustrating and it's not always very responsive, but oftentimes putting in a mosquito request in specific, if it's an abandoned property, they're usually pretty good at sending someone out to take a look and see if there's things that not the code enforcement piece, but the eliminating the containers or treating the containers to prevent mosquito emergence from them. And then, yeah, there's kind of mixed results from research to say whether it's those abandoned or unmanaged properties that contribute the most. Oftentimes it's what we have and we add water to, like for our pets or our bird baths or our plants, that actually cause more mosquitoes than some of those abandoned sites. Now that also just depends on the kind of rain that we're getting and how frequent it is. So it is both important to address, I guess, those abandoned properties, but as well to look at ourselves and our neighbors and where mosquitoes might be growing in our own backyards as well. Does that answer your question or not quite? Right. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of city code around that. And specifically, it was developed after the Zika virus epidemic in 2016 to kind of modernize it and take it from the early days of, so post yellow fever and the efforts that were done for mosquito control, then to modernize it, make it relevant to what we see today. So they do exist in city code. Enforcement is for sure an issue.
Hi, my name is Catherine Prevost, and I have a question. No one talked about the mold from the blight and the wood and stuff that's being left out. And I'm trying to figure out exactly what are we smelling? Because a lot of times inside of our communities, when you walk out in the morning with the dew, you have a sense of a smell of the mold, but you don't know exactly what type of mold you're smelling. So I'm hoping that maybe someone start looking at that as part of their data, especially inside of the communities that we are living in, where there's a lot of empty lots and a lot of blighted houses that are still standing.
Are airborne molds an issue at all? Do you have any expertise in that area? No. building issue related to?
I don't have any expertise in particular in mold, but I think it's something that definitely ought to be.
Is there a mold person?
My name is Becky Halligan. I'm from the School of Architecture. I'm an MSRED candidate right now, and I'll graduate in May. And actually, a mold story is what brought me to the program. My husband, we owned an HVAC company for about 10 years, and my husband ended up developing epilepsy due to mold exposure. I will say caveat, like he is healed now. He's better. He no longer has epilepsy. But it sent us on a journey of building science and building performance practices. So that's something while I most certainly have appreciated the MSRED program. I have also feel like that I've brought an awareness that we need healthier buildings. So our program is a program of practice. They take us on trips to see development in other places. And my, little elevator spiel was the built environment will do one of two things. It's either going to fuel health or it's going to fuel illness. So while nobody, on the panel kind of spoke about it, and I am still in a learning process, it has to do with our indoor air filtration. So we're not necessarily going to eliminate mold outdoors, especially when I have an appreciation for trees as well. We don't need to get rid of the trees, but they essentially in our climate are going to have mold present. Like we can't annihilate that. But what we can begin to implement is better building practices and standards. So our buildings do need to be sealed and we do need to have proper indoor air filtration. And with those things partnered along with good health and those types of practices, I feel like we can mitigate issues and kind of spearhead the issues.
Okay, well, while I don't have any particular experience in mold, I can tell you by an applied application of industrial hemp that it has reduced the moisture content in my home. It has reduced the operational costs of heating and cooling the home, and it has decreased the noise barrier. And so to date, as far as I know, the Louisiana Department of Ag and Forestry has stated that it's the only application of industrial hemp that was retrofitted in a residential area. So we are working with one of our Waterwise neighborhood champions, whose expertise is in mold and remediation of mold, and that we're starting to have the data come back on the use of the energy use in the home. And so I can tell you I have a 2,800 square foot house, and my utility bill using solar powered, not stored, but just having solar panels as well, was $70. And then those of you who have been to the HCS Learning Center, you can tell the temperature difference in using industrial hemp in application of in building and retrofitting buildings for that. And it is mold resistant.
Hi, my name is Huiying Wu. I'm a postdoc in the Department of Environmental Health Sciences, and I'm also an environmental engineer. I want to ask a question about the community services. So my research is in microbial water quality. If I go to a new city and if I want to engage in serving the community, what suggestions do you have for me to start to feed back to the community members?
I will always say start with the community that you live in. And so get to know the people, get to know the cultural and social norms, and build relationships. All of this is about building relationships, trusting relationships, because people can build relationships and there's no trust, but building trusting relationships. If you're going in as someone, as your professional academic self, again, get to know that one person that's the gatekeeper of the community, that's not just checking off boxes, that they have a real concern for what happens in the community. And then finally, I'll say, leave that community with tangible assets. Long after you're gone, there's something in that community that they say that they needed that they can use further on and is sustainable. Sure. Thank you. And the residents in all of our communities, let me just say that they will let you know what they need, want, and don't want. Yeah.
So how many days of bad air quality is necessary for it to equate to smoking a pack of cigarettes? Like, are you saying like one day of bad air quality is associated with smoking a pack of cigarettes, or like over a period of time? And what index level it should there be?
So it's actually long-term exposure, like people who living in a community is polluted for a long time. Like it could be like their life course exposure, like people from they are born to the develop of the disease. So it's not like short-term exposure, just it's living experience in the communities or that is highly polluted. Like it's kind of like comparison study, like those people who are living in a communities, their pollution is like, let's say 10 units. And the other people who is living in a communities, their unit is like 5 units. The pollution unit is 5. So in that case, those who are living in a community with 10 units, they're getting more exposure compared to the who are living in a communities with 5 unit. So it's not like one day exposure, it's a long-term exposure, could be 1 year. And the studies, the report that I showed in my slides in CNN that made a report from. So on that paper, they use the 1 year average exposure, like the annual average exposure, like the people who living in a communities, what is their annual average of exposure, like the difference in the annual average of exposure. So 1 year average. So it's not like 1 day or 2 days or 5 days, but people, there are 2 types of effects of air pollution. One is the long term and one is the short term. So when people live in a communities, highly polluted communities for longer time, they are being susceptible to the effect of the short term. In that case, like people being vulnerable to the air pollution. So when something comes out, like one day, normal day, the pollution is like 10 microgram. In 1 day, like it goes up to like 20 micrograms, could be from high traffic volume or from the pollution coming from industries or wildfire. In that day, like people will go to the emergency department visit because they are already being vulnerable, living in a communities, long-term exposure to the air pollution. So that makes them more vulnerable to the people who live in a communities with low air pollution exposure.
Okay, we have a question for Dr. Rahman. Policymakers in Louisiana make the excuse that toxicologic studies have not made definite causal connections between carcinogenic air pollutants from petrochemical industries and Cancer Alley. They also use the data from the Louisiana Tumor Registry to show that cancer rates in Cancer Alley are not higher than cancer rates in other areas of the state. So for Louisiana policymakers, the evidence is not so much epidemiological as it is toxicological. Okay. Let me see how many, this is quite a long question. With climate change adding some synergistic effects to the disease burdens in Cancer Alley communities, the need for targeted intervention is compelling and urgent. But the legislators do not seem to agree because they have different assessments of what's happening in Cancer Alley. How may your research help change minds among the legislators?
I think that's a good question. So I think the science and the evidence that based on a study, and it should not be based on a one single study. So we need actually repeated study and replicating the evidence. Like I think the question that comes could be from one single study. So we need repeated study, people with different methodological approach, different statistical approach. So when, like, let's say they're now, based on my literature review, there is not enough study. It's an understudied reason, although it is highly vulnerable to the climate change. So let's say there's 20 studies and 15 studies found that there is a connection. Then that will make the evidence. So then that's why I mentioned that we need actually more studies to make it more clear to the policymakers. The single study is not enough. So I think we need more studies to make it. I'm not sure at this point, but the studies that conducted in other places, in other part of the world, they found a strong connection between exposure to either air pollution from fossil fuel or petrochemicals. Those people who living in fence line, especially the fence line community, the vulnerable communities, and the any kinds of health burden is higher on that community. So why maybe one single or two studies here did not find that? So that's a question. That's why I think more research need to be conducted. And I think one of the big challenge doing research in Louisiana, in my short experience, I have been here for only 7 months, is the data availability. So data should be available to the researcher, so the researcher can access to this data at the fine resolution level, like could be their residential address level, like the data I received from California and New York, and they are like at their address level. So I know their home address. So in that case, if the state provide me data at the zip code level, then it's a broader reason, like it hard to connect who is living closer to the petrochemicals, who is not. So I need the fine resolution data is necessary for making this evidence. And as I mentioned that there are many different ways to look at the single data. So people will give one single data to researcher. 7 different researchers will analyze this data in a 7 different ways. So I think more the one single answer to this question is it's understudied reason. We need more research in this area, and data, especially the health data, should be available to the researcher at the fine resolution level, so that we can dig more into that.
And also you worked with very large data sets as well. So the access to large data sets is important. And then that actual being able to figure out where people exactly live. Some of the reports that the person who is asking the question indicated aren't looking at large populations. They're looking at small populations, and then they're stratifying them into smaller and smaller levels. So it's harder to find it when you're looking at it that way. So it's a combination of needing lots of data over time, and access to that data. Right. So I think we're about ready to wrap up. Dean Leviste, oh, you have a question?
Just wanted to add something to that question. So 60 years ago, the Surgeon General declared smoking as a carcinogen. And then over the next 50 years, scientists did studies showing an association between smoking and a variety of health outcomes, including cancer. And every time that would happen, what the policymakers said was, well, it's just an association. There's no proof that there's causality there. Because we know association is not necessarily causation. So what we know from working with policymakers is that they're not necessarily going to just be convinced by the evidence and just by the data. And so that's not necessarily the goal, I think, is to convince them by the evidence, because they have many different variables that they're weighing in their decision making and where they come up with their conclusions. What we have to do is we do have to keep putting the research out, and we have to make sure that the preponderance of the evidence is so strong, they get overwhelmed with the amount of studies that demonstrate the causation, well, the association between whatever the carcinogen or whatever the environmental health risk is and the health outcome. But more importantly, we need to convince the general public, because that is what's ultimately going to move the policymakers. It's not going to just be some great paper that shows, this relationship, and they're going to be convinced by that. It's going to have to be that they see that there's some support in the community for them taking the steps that you want them to take. And we have to find ways to, and we do have, this is one of the reasons why I think it's so important that these types of topics be across the entire university and the school, and not just for the environmental scientists. Because those of us in health policy, we focus on this very issue all the time. How do we communicate with policymakers? How do we bring the science into the work that we do with policymakers? And there are strategies that are effective, but you have to be very thoughtful about how you do it. And it's not simply a matter of another study who showed that living in an environment with a lot of air pollution is similar to smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. That's not going to convince people, but rather that's not going to convince policymakers, because what they'll say is there are plenty of people who spend thousands of dollars, hundreds of dollars a year to smoke a pack of cigarettes per day. And we also know that while smoking increases the risk of lung cancer, we know that the vast majority of smokers will never get lung cancer, right? And that nuance is understood by scientists because we understand risk, but policymakers are not focusing on risk quite in that way. So I know this is kind of getting long, but basically what I wanted to say is that there are strategies for how you can message to policymakers, and there are a lot of people who do focus on that, and that's what we need to be thinking about. But it's not going to just be more research, more studies, and therefore they are going to respond just to the science, because often science does not win out when we go into the policy arena.
So science doesn't win out, it's the emotion.
It's okay. So I didn't want to get into this. Is more along my expertise than climate change, right? Which is what I find interesting. So back in the days when I used to actually teach classes and I taught health policy, I came up with this concept called the cat story. And what the cat story was about how, when sometime I'd go and testify in Congress and whatever, and you've got the researcher up there talking about their research and their data and their science and the p-values and the statistics. And I've sat in those rooms and I'm listening, I'm saying, I'm probably the only person in this room who understands what they're saying. And because they're talking about the science, right? And I get it, and I'm convinced, but most other people don't know, right? So you have that, and then somebody came up, and this is when this hit me sitting in the state legislature in Maryland. I was there for a hearing to testify, and I sat in for the rest of the hearings to hear the other speakers. And research after research after research, it went in there. Great studies, beautiful science. I'm like, yeah, we need to do this because these studies are really powerful. And then this woman comes up and she tells some story about a cat. And the cat is up the tree and something happens. And I don't even remember what the story was about, but it was about a cat. And then policymakers are going, because they understand the cat story, but they don't understand p-values. And so what I started talking about in my classes was, how do we weave a cat story around the science? In other words, a story that illustrates what the science is telling us, because that way of communicating is what's important, because that's the way the human brain works. We respond to story more than we respond to data and statistics. Most of us, including me, cannot necessarily make out what does a risk ratio really look like, right? So I know statistically what it does, but intuitively, that's not how our brains work. We work in story, and storytelling is the way that humans have communicated for thousands of years. So we have to take that science, and then we have to tell a story that illustrates what that science is telling us. That's the way we communicate in Congress and to policymakers. And we have people in this building who that's their expertise. So we have that capacity, and we need to marry that capacity with the science and bring that all together and go to Baton Rouge, go to Washington, and move policy that way.
So I think we need to make a story that includes our community, our research, our design, and our action. And a cat. I have a beautiful cat that will be happy to pose for this. Yes. Mm-hmm.
She won the day. All the scientists, because she had this compelling story about this cat. And I wanted to strangle that woman strangle her, but I was so impressed by that, and I said, that's what I need to incorporate this into my classes. They actually have an article I published recently, an essay about cat stories. That's how you win.
It's personal. You're getting personal with the people.
There we go. So any closing thoughts from anyone? I think the idea of weaving this into a story is going to be a really great way to go. Any ideas, any closing thoughts from anybody who'd like to add to that? I know Angela wants to make it into a shrimp po' boy instead of a cat, but we can do that.
I don't know if you know how a shrimp becomes a shrimp, but it actually starts in the grass. And so when you tell that story about why it's important for us to have coastal restoration and why climate change is important, because if we no longer have grasses in our wetlands, then we no longer have shrimp. And it's a fact. So shrimp starts in the grass, in the wetlands of our state. And so that would be my story. And every time I eat a shrimp po' boy, I think about having seen the shrimp at the beginning of its life cycle in the marshes in just south of here in St. Bernard Parish. So make it local.
Jobs are produced by the shrimping industry in Louisiana, and how many people are feeding their families from that? How much poverty?
Yes.
That's the story.
Yes.
That's how you tell that story.
Yes. So I'll show you the picture sometimes of the shrimp cycle. I just want to say to Dean Levis, thank you for having the vision to bring us together in this forum at this time, to bring both community and academics together to understand that we are all collectively powerful to make this a more resilient region. So I just want to say thank you for that. And then thank you, Dean Melissa, for seeing me speak what is it, 2 years ago at the River Fest here. And I'm just the little girl from the 7th Ward who the investment was made in a long time ago in education to be able to give back to the residents, and not only my community, but for the women and the gentleman that's representing the communities here. We are real people, and we are leading this effort in green infrastructure and resiliency. $19.3 million in ecosystem benefits. That's a lot of money. And we didn't realize that we were only measuring our successes in capacity. But when you start talking dollars and cents in the work that we do it and how we do it collectively, that's impact that we can make not only here, but across this region. And I just wanted to end with that. Yes.
I do want to thank all of you for taking the time to do your presentations tonight and help us start to weave this story together. I think we have a story here. We have a lot of different parts of the story. We are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to climate change and health, design, action, and research. And I really want to thank all of you for staying the entire time and contributing your questions. And please do register so that we can get more information to you on the next everything else that we're doing beyond tonight, being involved in developing our story together, because we're all living here together. And those of you that are students, those of you that are from our College of School of Architecture and Planning, our colleagues from the State Health Department, visitors, friends, and all of the staff that made this possible, I thank you all. So please keep in touch and do register so that we have your information and we can keep in touch. So thank you. Good night.
Yeah. Yeah, and they're. And follow up about the next things. Yeah.
Thanks for your help.
Yeah, all right, see you later.